Somewhere in the vast green interior of Brazil, on an ordinary morning, a soft-spoken man wakes before dawn, washes, and opens his Bible. He does not drink. He has never smoked. He does not chase other women. He loves his wife. And he is, by every account of the people who knew him, a devoted and faithful husband and a tender father. He is polite to strangers. He is gentle with animals. He reads scripture in the quiet before the sun comes up, and he prays, sincerely, humbly, the way a man prays who genuinely believes that a God is listening and keeping accounts. Then he kisses his family and he picks up a small bag and he travels, sometimes for days, by boat and by bus and on foot, to a town where he knows no one and no one knows him. There he waits. He is patient the way a fisherman is patient, because he was raised a fisherman, and patience is the only real skill his trade requires. He watches a man he has never met and has no personal quarrel with, a stranger whose name he was handed along with a photograph and a payment. He waits for the moment when the stranger is alone and unguarded, and then, calmly, with the steadiness of a man who has done this many, many times, he raises a gun and kills him, usually with a single shot. He does not linger. He does not gloat. He feels no thrill, no rush, no pleasure. Only, he would say, a heavy and familiar sickness in his soul. And then he does the thing that makes this one of the strangest true stories you will ever hear. He prays for the man he has just killed. He asks God to receive the soul of the stranger lying dead at his feet, and he asks God to forgive him, the killer, for what he has just done. And then he goes home to his family and reads his Bible and waits for the next name. By his own account he kept for years in a notebook, the way an accountant keeps a ledger, he did this to nearly 500 human beings. 492, he said, before he simply stopped counting. Across roughly 4 decades, from a frightened teenager to a graying man in his 50s, he traveled the back rivers and frontier towns of Brazil, killing strangers for money and praying for every one of them. And he was possibly the most prolific contract killer of the entire 20th century. And here is the part that should stop you cold. In all those years, across all those deaths, he never served a real prison sentence. He was never convicted. For most of his life, the law did not even know his name. So sit for a moment with the paradox at the dead center of this story, because it is one of the most disturbing in all of true crime. This was not a monster. Not in any way you would recognize a monster. He was not a sadist. He took no joy in killing, he claimed, and the man who spent years interviewing him came to believe that he hated it, that it tormented him, that he tried again and again to escape it. He was a kind, religious, family man who happened to murder people professionally for 40 years, and who wept over it and prayed over it and did it anyway, 500 times. How does that happen? How does a gentle boy from a poor fishing family become the deadliest hired gun in a nation of 200 million and stay gentle the whole time? How does a man reconcile a genuine, aching Christian faith with a ledger of the dead? And how, in the name of everything, does a man kill on that scale for that long and never once see the inside of a cell? The answer is a story about the most frightening kind of evil there is. Not the evil that hates, but the evil that is simply, quietly, obediently for hire. To understand how a decent man becomes a mass killer without ever becoming a monster, you first have to understand a world most of us have never had to imagine. A world where killing is not a crime of passion or a snap of madness, but a service with a price, available for purchase like any other. Because the man in this story was not a lone wolf hunting for pleasure. He was a professional filling a demand. And to understand him, you have to understand the market he served. Picture the Brazilian frontier in the second half of the 20th century, the immense roadless interior, the Amazon basin, and the lawless cattle and land country around it, a territory larger than most of the countries of Europe, where the reach of the state simply runs out. Out there, the law is not a wall, it is a rumor. There is no reliable police, or the police are for sale. There are no functioning courts within a practical distance, or the courts belong to whoever owns the most land. Disputes that in a city would go to a lawyer, out there go to a gun. Who owns this stretch of river? Whose cattle graze this valley? Who insulted whom? Who slept with whose wife? Who owes whom? Who testified against whom? In a place without law, every one of those questions has the same final answer. And the answer is a man with a rifle willing to settle it. That man has a name in Brazil. He is a pistoleiro, a gunman, a hired killer, an institution as old and as embedded in the backlands as the cattle and the mud. The pistoleiro is not an aberration in that world. He is part of its economy, as ordinary as the ferryman or the shopkeeper, a landowner who wants a squatter gone, a family that wants a rape or a murder avenged, a politician who wants a rival silenced, a businessman who wants a debtor erased. They do not call the police, because the police are useless or complicit. They find a pistoleiro. They agree on a price. They hand over a name, a photograph, sometimes a down payment. And a stranger dies, and everyone understands what happened, and almost nothing happens next, because that is the second half of the machine, and the more important half, impunity. Impunity is the true product of the backlands. In that world, the killing of a poor man, a farmer, a fisherman, a laborer, a nobody is very often simply not investigated at all. There is no forensic team. There are no cameras. There is frequently no autopsy, no serious inquiry, no paper trail. A body is found on a riverbank or a jungle road, and it is buried, and life goes on. The odds that a killing out there would ever be solved, prosecuted, and punished were so vanishingly small that they hardly entered the calculation. This is the essential thing to grasp, the thing that makes the rest of the story possible. On that frontier, murder for hire was not a high-risk crime. It was a low-risk job. The horror of this story is not that one evil man got away with it. The horror is that the world he lived in was built from the ground up so that he almost could not fail to get away with it. And the timing of his life poured fuel on all of it. His career unfolded across the exact decades when that lawless interior was being violently pried open. From the mid-1960s into the 1980s, Brazil was ruled by a military dictatorship that threw open the Amazon and the lands around it to settlement, cattle, and money. Highways cut into the forest, land offered up to whoever could seize and hold it. What followed was a slow-motion war over territory. Ranchers and speculators and land companies pushed against small farmers, squatters, river people, and the indigenous. And the pushing was very often done at gunpoint. Titles were forged, boundaries were enforced with rifles, and inconvenient people, a farmer who would not sell, a union man who organized the poor, a priest who took the peasant's side, had a way of turning up dead on a back road. Every one of those deaths was a transaction, and every transaction needed a hand to carry it out. The same dictatorship also ran its own quieter, darker war against those it branded subversives and enemies. And that shadow work, too, sometimes reached out into the interior for men who could kill discreetly and be denied absolutely. It was, in the coldest economic terms, a booming market for exactly one profession, and he had already, at 17, been sorted into it. And that world needed a particular kind of person to do the work. Not a raging psychopath. A raging psychopath is unreliable, conspicuous, and quickly dead. What the market rewarded was the opposite. A calm, patient, disciplined, forgettable man. A man who could travel to a strange town and not be noticed. A man who could wait for days without drawing attention. Take his single shot and vanish. A man steady enough not to panic. Disciplined enough not to drink or brag, and ordinary enough that no witness would ever describe anything more useful than a quiet man, medium height, nothing special about him. The perfect pistoleiro was not a wild beast. He was a gray, reliable professional. He was, in the most chilling possible sense, an employee, which is the terrible frame you have to hold as we meet the man himself. He was not a demon who chose evil. He was a gentle, competent, obedient man who was fed, one job at a time, into a machine that turned exactly his kind of decency and discipline into a weapon. To understand how, you have to go back to a poor fishing village and a frightened 17-year-old boy and the single worst favor a beloved uncle ever asked of anyone. His story, as he would eventually tell it, and almost everything we know comes from his own telling, decades later, to the one journalist he ever trusted, begins not with a killer, but with a good boy. And that is the first thread you have to pull, because the whole horror of what he became only makes sense against how ordinary and how gentle he started. He was born in the early 1950s into a poor fishing family in the Brazilian interior, one of those families that lives close to the river and close to the bone, where a child's labor is not optional and hunger is a familiar guest. He was raised religious, in the plain, deep, unquestioning faith of the rural poor, and the faith took. He was not a violent boy. He was not a cruel boy. By his own account and by the picture that emerges from those who knew him, he was quiet, dutiful, obedient, and kind. A son who loved his parents, a boy who believed in God and heaven and hell as literal, present facts. If you had looked at that child and been asked to guess his future, the deadliest hired killer in the country is the last thing you would ever have said. You would have guessed fisherman, like his father, a quiet life on the water, a good, small, forgotten life. And then there was the uncle. Every version of this story turns on the uncle, because the uncle is where the ordinary world and the killing world touched. He was a beloved figure to the boy, charismatic, generous, admired, the kind of relative a poor child looks up to and wants to please. He was also, the boy would only gradually understand, a military policeman who moonlighted, quietly and profitably, as a pistoleiro. In that backland world, the two roles were not even a contradiction. A man with a uniform, a gun, and no fear of the law was ideally placed to also be the man who settled things for money. The uncle lived comfortably inside both worlds, respectable and lethal at once, and the boy adored him without knowing the second half of what he was. The first killing came in August of 1971, when the boy was 17 years old, and even that first one arrived dressed as something other than murder. It came dressed as justice. In a neighboring community, a man, a fisherman by the accounts, a grown adult, had raped a young girl of 13. In that country, there was no realistic hope that the law would ever punish him. So the girl's father did what people out there did when the law would not help. He went to the uncle, and he paid to have the rapist killed. And the uncle, for reasons the boy would spend the rest of his life turning over, testing him, initiating him, needing a hand, believing him ready, brought his gentle 17-year-old nephew along and put the job in his hands. Try to inhabit that moment. A frightened boy, 17, who has never hurt anyone, is handed a gun by the uncle he worships and told that the man in front of him is a child rapist who will otherwise never face any punishment at all. It is presented not as a crime, but as a duty, a hard, righteous thing that a man does. And the boy, terrified, wanting to be brave, wanting to please the uncle, half believing he is serving justice, pulls the trigger and kills a human being. And in that single moment, the trap of his entire life closes shut behind him. Because in that world, there is no such thing as killing just once. He does not yet know it, standing there, sick and shaking over his first body, but he has just crossed a line that the world he lives in will never, ever let him cross back. What makes this man unforgettable is not simply that he killed. Plenty of men in the backlands killed. What makes him unforgettable is the way two utterly incompatible things lived inside him at the same time, for 40 years, without either one destroying the other. A genuine, tormented Christian conscience and a cold, patient, deadly professionalism. He was, at once, the most reluctant killer imaginable and one of the most effective who ever worked. To understand him, you have to hold both halves at once, because he did. Start with the professional. Over the years, the frightened boy became a craftsman of the worst possible craft, and he became superb at it precisely because of the qualities that made him a good and gentle man. He was patient, He could sit on a target for days, watching, learning the man's habits, waiting for the clean and certain moment, because he had the patience of a fisherman and none of the ego that makes lesser killers rush. He was disciplined. He did not drink, did not use drugs, did not brag in bars, did not draw attention, did not leave a trail of loose talk the way vain men do. He was forgettable, average in every physical way, quiet, polite, the kind of man who could pass through a town and leave no impression on anyone. And he was accurate. His trademark, by his account, was economy, the single well-placed shot, the clean job that minimized suffering and maximized the odds of a quiet escape. He traveled light and far, killed strangers he had no connection to, and melted back into the enormous anonymity of the country. Every trait that would have made him a wonderful neighbor made him an almost uncatchable assassin. His decency was, hideously, part of his tradecraft. And then there is the other half, the half that turns this from a crime story into something closer to a nightmare of the soul. Because he never, by every account, stopped believing. He never made peace with what he did by deciding it did not matter. He did not become a nihilist or a sadist who enjoyed the work. The interviews and the records suggest the exact opposite. Every killing cost him. He was tormented by his conscience with each shot, sickened, haunted. And so he did the only thing a believer trapped in damnation knows how to do. He prayed. He is said to have prayed over his victims, asking God to take their souls and to forgive him his own. He is said to have kept records, the count, the details, the names, a ledger of the dead carried in a notebook, not out of pride, but out of something more like the terrible bookkeeping of a man who could not let himself forget, who needed to hold each death as real. He knew, in the deepest part of himself, that what he was doing was monstrous. He believed in a God who saw it. He believed in a hell that waited for it. And he did it anyway. 500 times, weeping and praying the whole way. That is the paradox that makes ordinary explanations useless. We want our killers to be either monsters who feel nothing or ordinary people snapped by one terrible moment. He was neither. He felt everything, understood everything, condemned himself constantly, and kept working. His faith did not stop him. It only made him suffer while he did not stop. And that raises the darkest question of all, the one that hangs over the whole rest of the story. If he hated it so much, if it tortured his soul so completely, if he genuinely believed he was damning himself with every job, then why, for the love of God, did he not simply stop? The answer to why he could not stop is the true engine of this story, and it is more frightening than any single murder, because it is a trap that did not require a monster to build or a monster to spring. It only required a first yes. Everything after the first killing was the slow, logical, almost gravitational consequence of a boy who said yes once to an uncle on a frontier where no is a word that can get you killed. Understand first that in that world, a reputation is not something you choose. It is something that happens to you. Once the boy had done a job, done it cleanly, quietly, reliably, word moved. In the way word always moves in that world, along the hidden channels that connect the men who need killing done to the men who do it. He had proven he could be trusted to do the work, and just as importantly, trusted to keep his mouth shut. In a business built entirely on discretion and reliability, those two qualities are worth more than gold. And the young man who had them was a rare and valuable commodity. So the second job came, and because he did that one well too, the third came. He had not applied for a career. He had simply, once, been unable to refuse. And the backlands had quietly filed him under a heading he would never be allowed to leave. He is one of the men who will do it. And here, the trap tightens with a logic that is almost unbearable. To be known as a pistoleiro is to be trapped by your own clients. These are not people you can simply disappoint. The men who hire killers are, by definition, dangerous men. Landowners, bosses, powerful figures. And sometimes, in the years of Brazil's military dictatorship and its dirty campaigns against perceived enemies, agents connected to the machinery of the state itself. When a man like that hands you a name, no is not a neutral answer. A killer who refuses a job, or who tries to walk away from the life, is a loose end. A man who knows too much, who has done too much, who could talk. The safest thing a nervous client can do with a pistoleiro who wants out is to hire another pistoleiro to close the account. His very skill and his very knowledge, the things that made him valuable, also made him too dangerous to be allowed to quit. He was welded to the trade by the same fear he used on others. The hunter lived his whole life one refusal away from becoming the hunted. And then there was the money, in the shape of a poor man's life. Each job paid $1, sometimes little, sometimes more, $1, and the money fed a family, built a life, created dependence and expectations, and a standard of living that the fishing he had been born to could never match. Money is a soft chain, but a real one. Every payment made the next job a little more necessary and a little more normal, until killing was simply the thing he did for a living, the way another man drives a truck or works a field. He was not getting rich in any spectacular way. He was doing what poor men trapped in bad work have always done, taking the next job because there was a family to feed and no clean door out. So picture the box he was standing in and notice that not one wall of it required him to be evil. His clients would kill him if he refused. The law offered him no protection and no path to safety, since surrendering meant admitting to a mountain of murders in a system that might simply execute him or hand him to his enemies. His family needed the money, and his own reputation, the thing that kept him employed, was also the thing that kept him imprisoned. Every rational exit was sealed. The only door left open, always, was the next job. And so, hating it, praying over it, longing to escape it, he walked through that door again, and again, and again, and the count in the notebook climbed toward a number almost no other private killer in modern history has ever reached. Let us finally look directly at the number, because the number is where the mind rebels and refuses to believe, and the disbelief is itself part of the story. 492. That is the figure he gave, the count he said he kept until he could no longer bear to keep it, and simply stopped. Not 4 or 5, the tally of an ordinary murderer. Not a few dozen, the horrifying record of a serial killer who would be infamous the world over. Nearly 500 human beings, erased one at a time by one patient man, across 4 decades of quiet, backcountry work. It is worth being honest about that number, because honesty is the only thing that makes it bearable to discuss. The count of 492 is his own. It comes from his own mouth, his own memory, his own notebook, given years later to a single journalist. There was no trial that established it, no forensic investigation that confirmed it body by body, no court that tested it. It is entirely possible the true number is different, inflated by a haunted man's imagination, or just as chillingly understated because he stopped counting. What we can say is that the man who spent 7 years interviewing him, chasing down what could be traced across the vast and record-poor interior, came away convinced that he was dealing with a real and monstrously prolific killer, not a fantasist. The precise figure will probably never be provable, but the scale is not seriously in doubt, and even the low end of any honest estimate places him among the most prolific killers of any kind that the modern world has produced. Look at who filled that ledger, because the variety of it tells you everything about the machine he served. It began, we are told, with a rapist, a killing dressed as justice. But justice was only the doorway. After that came the ordinary business of the frontier, the land disputes, where a gunman removes the man standing between a powerful person and the property he wants, the private vengeances paid for by grieving or enraged families, the unfaithful spouses killed by a betrayed husband's money, the debtors, the witnesses, the rivals, the inconvenient, and, in the darkest chapters, the political killings, The human targets handed to hired gunmen in the years when the state itself or men acting in its shadow wanted certain people gone and wanted no fingerprints on the doing of it. His victims were not connected by anything except this. Someone, somewhere, decided each of them should die and had the money to make it a market transaction. He was the mechanism. He was the trigger that other people's hatreds and greeds and fears pulled by proxy at a safe and deniable distance for a fee. And then there is the notebook, which may be the single most haunting object in the whole account. Most killers of great number, if they keep records at all, keep them as trophies, grim souvenirs of their power, kept to be savored. Everything about this man suggests the opposite motive. He wrote down the details, the names where he had them, the running tally, and the impression that survives is not of a hunter admiring his kills, but of a bookkeeper who could not let himself pretend the debt was not real. It was, in its awful way, an act of conscience, a refusal to let the dead dissolve into a blur, a stubborn insistence on holding each one as a separate, countable human life. And it is precisely that impulse that makes the record so unbearable. A man numb enough to feel nothing would have no need to count. A man who counts is a man who is still keeping faith in some broken corner of himself, with the idea that each death mattered. He built himself a ledger of his own damnation and carried it for decades, and the carrying of it was, in the strangest sense, the most human thing about him. And the impunity held almost perfectly the entire time, which is the second half of why the number could climb so high. A man cannot kill 500 times in a world with functioning justice. He is caught after the first or the third. He could only do it because that world was engineered for exactly this blindness. There was, by his account, essentially one moment of real danger from the law in all those years, an occasion when he was actually taken into custody after a killing. And even that ended not with a courtroom, but with a bribe. He is said to have handed over a motorcycle to buy his freedom and walked away. That is the whole measure of the world he worked in. The deadliest hired killer in the country was arrested one time in 40 years and got out by giving up a motorbike. The law was not a threat he outsmarted. The law was barely there at all. But there is one authority that a man of his particular kind could never bribe, never outrun, never make a deal with, and it lived inside his own head, and it had been keeping its own ledger since the very first shot. Because the count in the notebook was not the only tally being kept, and by the time he was a graying man, the weight of the other ledger had grown almost too heavy to carry. For all the years he spent as the frontier's most reliable instrument of death, the most human and most harrowing part of his story is the war he was losing inside himself the entire time. Because he wanted out, badly, for a very long time, and could not find the door. This is the chapter that separates him from a simple villain, and it is also, in a way, the most damning, because it means he understood exactly what he was and did it anyway. The torment, by every account, was real and constant. He was not a man who had numbed himself into a comfortable monster. He carried each killing. He is described as haunted, sickened, unable to shake the faces, praying compulsively for forgiveness he did not believe he deserved. He lived a double life so complete that it seems almost impossible. The tender husband and father and neighbor in one frame, the traveling executioner in the other, and the same conscience straining to hold both without shattering. Imagine coming home from murdering a stranger to help your children with their small troubles, to sit at your wife's table, to bow your head and thank God for the food. Imagine reading scripture that promises hell to the shedder of innocent blood, believing it literally and knowing precisely how many times you have shed it. That was his daily life for decades. The suffering was not a detail of his story. It was his story. Think about what that double life actually demanded of a single mind, day after day, year after year. Most people who do terrible things build a wall to survive them. They harden. They rationalize. They tell themselves a story in which they are not really the villain, and behind that wall they go on functioning. He seems never to have managed, or perhaps never to have allowed himself to build the wall. He kept the two lives in the same body, fully aware of both, refusing the anesthetic of self-justification that would have let him rest. The man who traveled to a strange town to end a stranger's life was the identical man who came home and was, by every account, genuinely kind, a good father, a faithful husband, a helpful neighbor, a believer at prayer. Not two people, one. And that is far more disturbing than a split personality would be, because it means the kindness was not a mask over the killer, and the killer was not a mask over the kindness. Both were real. Both were him. He was living proof that a human being can contain, side by side and both entirely sincere, a tender love of his own children and a professional willingness to make orphans of someone else's, and can feel the contradiction like a blade every single day and still not be broken enough by it to stop. And he tried to stop. That is the thing to hold on to. This was not a man who reveled in his work and only regretted it when the interviews began. By the accounts he gave, he attempted, more than once, to leave the life, to refuse, to become only the fisherman and the family man he had been born to be. But we have already seen why every attempt met the same wall. To quit was to become a liability, and a liability in that world does not retire. It disappears. The very clients who paid him were the ones who could least afford to let him walk around free and idle and possibly talkative. And so each time he reached for the door, the logic of the trade, and, one suspects, the simple grinding need for money in a poor man's life pulled him back. He was a prisoner, serving a life sentence in a prison with no walls, no bars, and no guards, held in place entirely by fear and poverty and the memory of what he had already done. There was nowhere to confess that would not also be a place to be destroyed. That is the peculiar, awful loneliness of his position, and it is worth sitting with because it is the engine of everything. A murderer who feels nothing is, in a grim way, free, untroubled, integrated, at peace with himself. A murderer who feels everything and cannot stop is in a hell of a far stranger kind, fully awake to his own damnation, keeping careful count of it, praying through it, and utterly unable to climb out. He had the conscience of a good man and the record of a monster, and the two could never be reconciled and could never be separated. He could not become numb enough to be comfortable, and he could not become brave enough or free enough to actually stop. So he simply continued, year after year, carrying a weight that would have crushed most people, until the weight and the years finally, quietly, brought the work to its end. And when the killing did at last stop, and an old man was left alone with his notebook and his memories and his God, there came the strangest turn of all, the one that would finally drag his secret and his count and his prayers out of the silent interior and into the light of the wider world. Every story like this promises a reckoning and demands one. We need the ledger balanced, the killer punished, the scales set right. And the reckoning that actually came for this man is the most unsettling ending of all, because by every ordinary measure of justice, it never came at all. The most prolific hired killer of his time was never tried, never convicted, never imprisoned. The law of his country, which failed all 492 of his victims while they lived, failed them one final time in death. It never made him answer for a single one. The truth of his life reached the world not through a courtroom but through a journalist. A Brazilian investigative reporter named Cléster Cavalcanti came onto the trail of a story almost too outlandish to believe, a frontier pistoleiro with a body count in the hundreds, and did the patient, dangerous work of actually finding the man behind the rumor. What followed was one of the more extraordinary relationships in the literature of true crime. Over the course of roughly 7 years, Cavalcanti drew the story out of him, largely over the telephone, across countless hours, a killer confessing his life to a writer he had somehow come to trust. Out of that came a book, O Nome da Morte, The Name of Death, published in 2006, which laid the whole impossible account before the public, and went on to win one of Brazil's most prestigious literary prizes. Years later, it became a feature film. The gentle killer who had spent 40 years as a nameless shadow on the frontier became, in his old age, the subject of a bestseller and a movie. his confession transformed into a story consumed by strangers. But even that public exposure must carry its honest caveats, and they matter. The name the world knows him by is a pseudonym, a shield adopted to protect a man who had never been convicted of anything and could not simply be handed to the courts on the strength of a book. The number, 492, remains his own claim, unprovable in any court, resting on the memory and the notebook of the one person with any reason to know it and every reason to be an unreliable narrator of it. We are left, in the end, trusting the account of a self-confessed mass murderer, filtered through a journalist who believed him. What we can be reasonably sure of is the shape of the thing, that a real man really did work for decades as a backland assassin, that he killed a great many people, and that he was never punished for it. The exact edges of the truth are lost, probably forever, in the same vast and unrecording wilderness that let him operate in the first place. So where is the reckoning? If you were looking for it in handcuffs and a cell, there is none, and that absence is itself the verdict this story determines. A verdict not on one man, but on an entire world. He was never caught, because that world was built not to catch men like him. He was never punished, because the poor and forgotten people he killed were, to the system, exactly that: poor and forgotten, and not worth the cost of justice. His impunity was not a personal triumph of cunning. It was a structural fact, a feature of a place where the law had simply never arrived. The real horror of his 4 decades is not that one clever killer beat the system. It is that there was no system to beat. Which returns us, at the very end, to the paradox we began with, and to the genuinely frightening thing it teaches, a thing far more disturbing than any ordinary monster could show us. We are comfortable with evil when it looks like evil. The sadist, the psychopath, the man who kills for pleasure. That kind of evil, however terrible, at least confirms our sense that killers are a different species from us. This man offered no such comfort. He was kind. He was faithful. He was devout. He loved his family and prayed to his God and wept for his victims and believed, sincerely, that he was damned. And he killed nearly 500 people anyway, one obedient job at a time, because the world around him made killing a job and made refusing it a death sentence. He proves the most unbearable proposition in all of criminology, that under the right conditions, in the absence of law and the presence of need, ordinary human decency is not a wall against atrocity at all. It can be folded up, quietly, and put to work. He knelt and prayed over every stranger he killed, and, in a way, that prayer is the most terrifying detail in the whole account, because it means he never once mistook what he was doing for anything but murder. He knew. He always knew. He counted. He grieved. He begged forgiveness. And then he picked up the next name, and he did it again.